Hey guys, so I'm back and I'm here to do a review for the Smashbox Double Exposure palette that I picked up during the Sephora VIB sale, and I decided to do a quick review on this palette to let you know my thoughts, so let's just jump right into it. So the Double Exposure palette is kind of Smashbox's sequel or follow-up to the Full Exposure palette that debuted last year. And if you remember, the Smashbox Full Exposure palette had 14 eyeshadows, 7 were mattes and 7 were shimmery shiny shades. It's a neutral palette with a double-ended brush. And now we have the Double Exposure palette, which has the same overall palette design and layout, but the eyeshadow theme is definitely not the same. These eyeshadows, actually we only have 3 matte eyeshadows in the palette, and the rest of the eyeshadows are either a satin or a shimmery metallic finish. And they say you can use these dry or wet, which is kind of the same with any eyeshadow on the market. You can use them either dry or wet. And for Smashbox to use that as a selling point for this palette kind of is laughable, because any eyeshadow can be used dry or wet, so that goes without saying. So that's any eyeshadow, Smashbox. Don't get ahead of yourself. So this palette has a multitude of colors. There's some neutral shades and some colorful shades, and the only overriding theme that you can see is you have more cool tone eyeshadows on one side and then more warm tone eyeshadows on the other side, and in the middle you have kind of 2 neutral shades. So that's the only theme that I can see in the palette itself and how the eyeshadows are organized. So the Smashbox Double Exposure palette retails for $52 for 14 eyeshadows at 0.04 ounces each, which is a little bit smaller than the typical small eyeshadow on the market, which is 0.05 ounces. So you're not getting quite a full-sized eyeshadow, but they are close enough to that 0.05 size to actually call it a full-sized eyeshadow. And there are 14 different shades, along with that double-ended brush and the deluxe size mascara in the palette as a bonus. And for me, the price was in line with the other similar types of palettes on the market. For instance, the Urban Decay Naked palettes, which have 12 eyeshadows, retail for $54 with a price hike of $10 over the last 2-3 years, so imagine that. So Smashbox is actually cheaper than the Urban Decay eyeshadows, but it's in line with what you'd expect from a palette of this size in a mid-range brand. For example, Urban Decay, Too Faced, Stila, all those brands have similar sized palettes and their similar price range. With this kind of being in the middle, it's not quite the $49 or $48, but it's not quite $50 and $60 that Urban Decay has been selling their palettes for. So it's kind of middle of the road, depending on how much you would like to pay for your palettes. So overall, the palette design is the same as the Full Exposure palette, with the cardboard packaging with a magnetic flap, which I think could be a little bit more secure, because that magnetic flap is all that is holding this palette together. So if you travel with it, it can get, you know, a little bit loose and then probably damage your eyeshadows. And I think it is a little bit too thick, especially if you have issues with storage. It's a little bit too thick and bulky, and I don't know that it needs to be that thick, except to have the brush in there, which the brush to me is a throwaway brush anyway, so it's just adding bulk where it's not necessary. So the palette does have the same design as the last palette, with the 3/4 sized mirror. So it's not a full-size mirror, but it's a large enough mirror. It's a cardboard design of the box, and then on the back you have the eyeshadow names. They actually gave them names this time rather than numbers. So you have silver, mauve, peony, etc. And you have all the eyeshadow details on the back. And then inside the palette you still have 14 eyeshadows in 2 rows of 7. Again, it's not differentiated by matte and shimmer anymore. And you also have a double-ended brush like the last palette. The bristles are actually very scratchy, so I don't really like the brush itself, but the design is a little bit different from the last brush, which had like 2 different bristles going on and a blend-in brush. I wouldn't use either of these brushes, because I just don't like how scratchy the bristles are. But if you're in a rush or you're in a pinch, you can probably just use that brush as well. So the packaging is run-of-the-mill okay, but I'm not in love with the packaging. I don't think it's the most, you know, luxurious. I don't think it's the most secure. I just don't think it's the greatest packaging of any palette. And then inside the actual box itself, you'll find different product information, and you'll find this little doodad, which is just a little sheet that tells you what's going to happen to each eyeshadow when they're applied wet or with a damp brush. And it says, you know, some turn metallic, some add sparkle, some gets deeper, some amps up vibrancy. And it says, don't worry about getting your eyeshadows wet. They'll never glaze over and will always dry like new. Which is interesting because I don't find that to be true, Smashbox. They also have this little eyeshadow guide that shows you different eye looks that you can get from the palette. So if you're a newbie or you want some ideas, they have a little sheet here, a little cheat sheet that shows you where to apply some of the eyeshadow colors and what colors to use for different looks. And you also get a deluxe size of the mascara, the Full Exposure Mascara from Smashbox, which is actually a decent mascara if you like those big full brushes. I don't find that it adds volume or does anything crazy. It's just a decent mascara, nothing too extraordinary, but it's a nice addition to the palette. So I'll give you an up-close view of the palette so you can see all the colors overall. And as you can see, these 6 eyeshadows on this side are more cool tone purples, berries, and blues. And on this side you have more warm tone shades with reds, burgundies, a little warm brown. In the middle you have a matte black and then a shimmery shiny shade. And since they gave the eyeshadows names, I'll just run through the names really quickly. Here we have Silver, Mauve, Peony, Haze, Temper, and Midnight. This is Noir, which is the black shade, and Blanc. Then we have Quartz, Flushed, and Veiled. And here we have Espresso, Fig, and Copper. Now I didn't do those in order, but I just wanted to make sure that you got all the shades from the cool side to the warm side. And here's the double-ended brush that I mentioned before. The first side is a flat shader brush. It's a little bit stiff and scratchy. And then the second side is an angled, really super scratchy brush. So I wouldn't use this brush at all because it's just super scratchy. Now let's just jump into the swatches so we can see what these eyeshadows look like and how they perform. So here we have the first row of shadows that are swatched over a primer. The first shade up is a silvery taupey shade with a golden flash. Then we have Mauve, which is a muted, very sheer mauvey purple shade with a satin finish. Then we have the shade Peony, which is a muted, dusty, pale pink shade. Then we have the shade Blanc, which is an icy, light silver shade with some golden sheen to it. It's a very smooth color. It comes off a little bit more pigmented than the other shades, and this is also a shimmer shade. Then we have Quartz, which is a beautiful golden peachy shade. This one has a little bit of a duochrome quality to it. It flashes golden, but it has a strong peach base. Then we have the shade Flush, which is a shimmer shade, and this one is like a coppery pink, but it's a very muted shade, but it applies very smoothly and has decent pigmentation even though it's a muted color. Next up we have the shade Veil, which is a satin shade, and it's a creamy light camel shade. There's definitely a little bit of yellow undertone to it, but it would make a nice highlight color, and this one was decently pigmented. It applied well and had decent color payoff. So I swatched 4 of the shades with a damp brush just to show you how they would transform when applied wet, and I do not like the result at all. In fact, they seem to apply a little bit more muted. They actually dulled down a lot when you applied them wet. And I didn't even wet my brush. I applied them damply, not soaking wet. And the little pamphlet said they'll turn metallic or gets more vibrant or gets deeper. And none of that is happening right now. To me, the colors are better when they're applied dry than wet. So that's that. So here we have the second row of shadows swatched, and these applied much better than the first row. These are a lot more pigmented, but they're also deeper, richer shades, so they come off with a lot more vibrancy, and this row may actually save the palette overall. The first shade up is Midnight, which is a satin shade, and it's a black base with a bluish violet sparkler sheen to it. Then we have the shade Temper, which is a satin shade as well, and it's more of a burgundy brown base with purple and violet sheen to it. Next up we have the shade Haze, which is a shimmer shade, and this one is a mauvey brown shade with a silvery purpley flash. It's a very interesting color. It's different if you can see how it catches the light. And then in the middle we have Noir, which is a matte black, and this one I had to pack on the color to get it to show up like this. It's not the most pigmented, it comes off a little sooty, but the actual color itself is a rich black. So if you can build it up, you'll get a rich black. Then we have the shade Copper, which is probably the best performance shade of the entire palette. This one is a shimmery brown bronzy coppery shade, and this one is definitely creamy, pigmented, applies creamy. It's very blendable, very smooth. Love this shade. Then we have the shade Fig, which is a matte kind of muted eggplant shade. It looks like a purpley brown is what it looks like, but it's a very muted color. This would make a great crease shade. It takes a little bit of building up. It doesn't give the best pigmentation. It's not my favorite shade. In fact, the matte shades probably are among the worst performing of the palette. And then we have Espresso, which is a matte deep dark brown shade. I think this one is decent. It's not the best, but it's decent, and it applied relatively well with decent pigmentation, and it wasn't too chalky or powdery. Again, I applied a few of the shades damp just to see how they would perform, and these definitely performed a lot better than the first row, but I don't see that they increased in intensity or vibrancy. This shade was actually supposed to add vibrancy and sparkle. I guess a little bit more of the shimmer sparkle showed up, and the Copper shade was supposed to get metallic. I think it looks pretty much the same way it did before. This shade here is the Haze shade. It dulled down a little bit, but the silver sheen, you can see it a little bit stronger. And then for the matte shades, this is the Espresso shade, which actually darkened up, and I think it would be nice for a liner if you used it wet, but those are 4 of the shades swatched damp. And then I was mentioning that the eyeshadows do get the film over them when you apply them wet. As you can see from these matte shades, they do develop that kind of hard film over it. When you apply a matte eyeshadow wet, you'll see that kind of film buildup. So Smashbox was not very truthful when they said you wouldn't have to worry about that. Now that you've seen the swatches, let's just go into how I feel overall about the palette. I don't like this palette at all. I think it falls short of what my expectations were for Smashbox, because Smashbox makes really nice eyeshadows. I just find that there were more fails in this palette than great eyeshadows. The darker shades like the Espresso and the Copper shade and even the black shade are nice eyeshadows, I think, and even the blue shade, but the other eyeshadows, like the top eyeshadows, to me just lacked in pigmentation and smoothness. They didn't really apply that well. I had to kind of dig into the palette to get the colors to show up. And they didn't blend really nice and adhere to the skin really nice when I was trying to use these eyeshadows. There are only about 4 or 5 eyeshadows that I would say were truly great eyeshadows in the palette. And out of 14, I think that is just a major miss. And I wouldn't invest $52 for 4 or 5 eyeshadows to actually work and perform well. So this palette to me is a total skip. Do not waste your money on this. I think that they could have done a lot better. And the Smashbox Masterclass palette, if you get a chance to grab that, grab that. That palette is really good, and it has some of the similar shades that you can find, and I think those perform far better than these eyeshadows. And I think it's just a few bucks more expensive and you get far more eyeshadows. So this one I wouldn't invest in. I would say skip. I am going to return this, and I'm happy that I got it on sale, so I didn't pay the full price for it because I don't think it's worth the full price. And as far as them touting that you can transform these shades into 28 different shades is a total bust, because the eyeshadows, when they were applied damp, either they dulled or they applied a little bit deeper, but not to the extent that you would be like, wow, these are totally transformed into an extremely different shade. It's just a little darker version of the existing shade. So I think that selling point was a total sham, and Smashbox should have never even said that and just put themselves out there like that, because they put themselves out there for failure. So total skip. Yeah, I'm returning this. This is on its way back. Hopefully you guys liked this review and found it helpful in deciding whether or not you're gonna pick up this palette, which I recommend you don't. I really think you should skip this palette. And as usual, I'll leave links below to my Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook pages where you can follow me along. And if you like this video, definitely hit thumbs up and favorites and share with your friends. I truly appreciate it. And thank you guys again so much for your support. I love you guys to no end, and I'm truly thankful for you every single day that I'm here on YouTube. So thank you guys so much, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.